Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is Reaction to Response. And with us today, we have Nicole Moen. And hello, Nicole. And before we begin, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping here. And one more second. Okay. And so today is the first day of our month of August theme around protecting yourself from a predatory economy. And today, Nicole Moen is going to be speaking with us about building an economy and service to life. Before we begin, though, let me just say once again that this is Reaction to Response, and we were birthed through the Charter for Compassion's Women and Girls sector. And the Charter for Compassion has over 400 cities with 1,800 partners in 52 countries around the world. And it's broken into 12 sectors, the women and girls sector being the most recent of them. And Reaction to Response was birthed through this as a way to help us in this time of chaos come up with creative solutions. You can learn more at thecharterforcompassion.org. Before we get into our call, I just want to address a couple of housekeeping things. First, this call is being recorded. Second, if you have any issues technologically, you can go to zoom.us. And then, of course, if you have any questions for Nicole or myself during this call, you can type them in the chat box and or hover down below on the bottom of your screen. You'll see a question and answer box pop up. Also, we have some people who are working behind the scenes, so I just want to say a shout out and thanks to Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. So as we do in most of our Reaction to Response calls, we look to address some of the sustainability goals, which we're going to address in a second, because I do want to mention one more thing, which is that after our call today, you can join us on the Reaction to Response after party, where we'll have a much more interactive video conversation with Nicole. And in the chat box, you'll see the direct link to it if you are not able to copy this down now. Without further ado, I'm going to switch us over into the sustainability goals. And as I said, most of you know that we begin this call addressing how today's topic touches on us advancing these goals. And in this process, Nicole and I had a really interesting conversation about whether, in fact, today's economic system, and if we're living in service to life, which is not what our present economic system is, can actually help us create the sustainable goals. And maybe they're not even fully obtainable. So with that, I just would like to say once again, thank you, Nicole, for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to switch. I'm going to keep the goals up right now, and let's just jump into the conversation. So there were three goals in particular that we got into a conversation about. One was
fascinating. This.
Sorry.
Endlessly fascinating. It's a subject.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So actually, you know what? Before we begin, can you give a brief introduction to what being an economy, being in service to life, would be like?
Sure. So my background in part comes through doing a lot of large event production. Started in integrative medicine, sustainable urban development, things having to do with children and nature, and a whole bunch of things like that in the arts. And also I did 4 years and about 70 events on Living the New Economy. It was a project that we did for 4 years. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today grew out of that very intense 4 years of diving deep into the subject, not as an expert in it myself, but learning from all the experts during the course of those 4 years, and seeing the weave amongst the various things that they all were talking about, and also the previous work I had done in integrative medicine and the sustainable urban development, and in particular. And so getting this really sort of high level sort of vision of what's possible. And that project wound down about a couple years ago now, I guess. But it stays with me, and it's evolving and has evolved. The phrase, by the way, an economy in service to life, is from a woman named Hunter Lobens, through also a woman named Donna Morton. So just to give credit where it's due, they're also working in this context, yeah. So basically, the fundamental thing is the dominant economy is predicated on turning living things into dead things for cash. That's the very blunt way of putting it.
So with that, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it just won't survive without that, and I believe that we won't survive with it ultimately. So how do we shift to an economy that is in service to life on Earth, including humans?
So I'm going to switch now to the sustainability goals.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, let's go a little bit through these.
Sure.
So we, in particular, we spoke about, first, number 4, about quality education.
Mm-hmm.
And you made a very interesting comment, which was, what are we actually educating ourselves, and what do we have to do, and how do we have to educate ourselves to create to a shift of building an economy in service to life rather than in death?
Yeah, my concern is that the way our education systems are operating currently is that we are training our children to do jobs that used to exist and won't exist in the future, and maybe they still exist now, but they're fading. There's still petroleum engineering programs. We will still need some number of petroleum engineers, but it's pretty clear from a lot of things that are happening, people are divesting from oil and gas, and the projects are lessening, and we're shifting to renewables. And so I'm not sure the education system has caught up with what's required to do that shift, just as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And also I did a series of events called on the topic of reskilling. So there are a number of capacities and really basic skills that we don't naturally learn in our households or in our schools anymore, like how to preserve food, for example, or how to mend our clothes, or how to build a chair, or something, really basic skills that we spend our cash to get somebody else to do now.
We also talked about permaculture as well.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right, because a lot of the problems that we're having when it comes to water, and certainly I should be a little bit, let's do a little bit of locating, because part of today's conversation is around the need for more local and sustainable movements and actions. So I'm here in California. I'm in the Monterey Bay area. It is, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to come back to the original land on whose property we are now on. But I did some, you're in my previous conversation and doing a bit of research. You're in Victoria, British Columbia, the land of the Algonquin people. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, one of our earlier conversations was about the sustainability, the wisdom that the original people bring to the land. So when we talk about education, can you speak a little bit about sustainable farming and permaculture?
Yeah. Well, the Kwanghan people on whose land I live, they didn't sell it or give it away, or they signed treaties that weren't honored, but so it's still their land. And I'm a 4th generation settler in Canada. Mm-hmm. So that's in my mind in everything I do now. I know that where I live here, I live in the southern tip of an island called Vancouver Island.
Mhm.
And the entire southern tip of the island was what's called in permaculture vocabulary a food forest. So basically, they managed the land in a way that ensured its continued viability to provide them with food, with clothing, with materials to make the things they needed, their homes, their cooking utensils and bowls and so on, their cultural needs. There's local indigenous people use a lot of masks um, in their dancing and their arts and their cultural mythology that held them together.
Mhm.
And so it provided them with all those things, and they harvested things in a way that ensured the sustainability of that. They never harvested more than 50% of what was available. They never harvested the first or the last thing they saw of an item they were looking for, and different principles and practices that were just known to them. And so
So,
monoculture is a totally different thing, and it depletes the resources. It's a depletion way of producing food. And so getting back to the permaculture that you were talking about, Lisa, I can see a world where we go back in a modern way, if that makes sense, to that kind of a food forest way of generating our food. We need food. That's a pretty fundamental thing. By turning the land into food forests.
mhm.
Instead of lawns or boulevard trees that look pretty, you can still have apple trees that look pretty and get food from them.
So actually, so you've now just brought me back to some of our other sustainability goals that you and I were talking about, and I want to focus on this, and then I want to go back to us being full screen because I'm sure people would like to see your face. Uh, so, um, so the other ones that we were talking about that are very much touched by an unhealthy, if you will, or an economy that feeds death, that may make, we said. Also, not just education, but the seventh one, which is affordable and clean energy, and how our present economy may not actually be able to support that. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that baffles me a little bit, frankly, is why we're not putting more energy into passive sources of energy, like passively heating our homes, particularly since there's a lot of sun out there. But I guess sometimes it's the air conditioning that needs to happen. I live in Canada, so we have a little of both going on, needing to heat our homes and cool our homes. Um,
Okay.
where to go with this one?
So, well, right. So I'm with you here, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into more of what an economy that supports life looks like. So I'm just going to tag them for now, so that we can then go a little bit further on. So right in this present economy, not only would education and affordable clean energy needs to make a shift, but also the eighth goal about decent work and economic growth. And that one of the things that you commented on was there really is no such thing as sustainable economic growth. And it's more that other things that need to grow, the plants, relationships, skills.
Yeah, I mean, if you understand that the growth of our current dominant economy relies on cutting down the trees and over taxing our soils so they're no longer viable, um, then there isn't there's an end point to that. We can't keep growing the economy and survive.
Mhm.
That's frank.
Right.
um, it and there's we were talking about Lisa, you and I, about the GDP never meaning in originally to be the measure of the health of a society. And it's not. It's a slice of the pie. One of the ways I look at economy is that there is something called the 8 forms of capital, or the multi-capital system, that I first read about in a book called Regenerative Enterprise by Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landois. And so they talk about the weave of 8 ways that we resource ourselves. There's financial, there's material things, physical things, and there's cultural capital, and there's social capital, and there's spiritual capital, and there's intellectual capital, and there's experiential capital. I don't know if I've gone through all the 8 there off the top of my head, but there are 8, and so they've developed a way to measure those and to understand the weave and how they support each other in support of life, ultimately. These fellows are also permaculturists, and so they understand the layering, both in terms of business and in social structures, but also how you plant out a piece of land to be sustainable.
Well, it's interesting because you're reminding me, earlier in our series, we had Riane Eisler on. And as you may be familiar with her work, she wrote the Real Wealth of Nations. And one of her whole frameworks is how do we shift from a domination system, which is actually a very destructive system, to one of partnership, where we're working in unity with one another and in unity with the planet, and that we bring in care as well, and include that in how we assess the well-being of a nation. Because actually GDP was, the intention of it was to assess the well-being post-World War II, to look at the economic growth. And in fact, the founder of GDP, one of the original writers of the document that was put through US Congress, never ever meant for it to be the way that we truly assess of well-being of nations. And what happened was that it was adopted by the UN, in this lens post-war, because the UN was birthed post-war. And so it then brought in GDP. And I think that that's a really important piece to keep in mind, that the whole way that we view the world was not the intention. And it's actually coming from a place of trauma. And so how that trauma and how we assess the well-being is coming from a place of sickness. And that's huge.
Oh my God.
You know?
We could spend.
Yeah, we can totally rip on this.
So true. I mean, if you get right down to, it's really important where these things are coming from. Post-World War II was a place of trauma. I've heard people talk about we're no longer in a post-World War II world. We're in a post-2008 world. And that too is trauma, though. So, the crash.
Well, right. And how many people's lives have been disrupted by a sick system and gone to bankruptcy? And to your earlier point about the things that are not really sustainable in this present economic framework, certainly, we see it's created more poverty. I mean, right where we live now, the cost of living has gotten so high that people have had to leave their houses. We have a whole section in our community that's just a road of homeless people living in RVs. Thank goodness we have beautiful climate that the outdoors you can live outdoors, but it's really, really painful.
That's happening here too, in Vancouver, across the water on the mainland, and here in Victoria increasingly. And again, in Canada, we're the warmest part of Canada, so there's an enormous number of homeless people, and that includes students who can't afford to rent a room from somebody because the cost of that has gone so high. So homeless, doesn't mean the folks that are ultimately unhomeable. There are some people who fall into that category, but it's a pretty broad, cross section now, of people, single mothers who have to work 3 jobs just to feed their kids, and like yeah.
So, so I want to sort of shift us a little bit, because I want to, again, we're looking at a framework, an economic framework that speaks to death.
Mhm.
And in my previous conversation, when we spoke not only about the framework of GDP, but also you shared with me something that I had never learned, and I've downloaded the movie to learn, but haven't watched it yet. And this is not a promotion for a film; it just happens to be. The name of the film is called The Corporation, and can you tell us a little bit about the history of corporations, because this is absolutely fascinating.
Oh yeah. So I learned from that documentary is that corporations their original way of being is that they were created to do a project like build a bridge. So they created a corporation to build the bridge, and when the bridge was built, they unincorporated. And so it was meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there was a natural, if you go back to nature, life and death cycle.
Mhm.
And trees grow, they flourish, they have their peak, and then they die. I mean, everything in nature has a natural life and death cycle, and the death of it feeds something else. It becomes compost and nourishment for some other thing that needs to come to life now, and that would have been similar if you extrapolate from that natural nature's system, if you want to call it that. It's more complex than that, but so the corporation coming to life, building the bridge, and unincorporating, then the people involved in that would go off into other lives and do other projects, and the bridge would have its life and death cycle too. But what's happened is that we've propped up the lives of these corporations in various ways, and so they continue to feed without becoming food,
Mm-hmm.
if you will.
Right. So just to sort of bridge and clarify a little bit, because we're hitting now two topics simultaneously that of course intersect, right?
Yeah.
One, first, the death that corporations were defined originally to be a project based, and then to be disincorporated or unincorporated,
Yeah.
and then start something new on a project basis. But you also just now touched on something very relevant, and again, to our topic of predatory economy. And that the other part of the conversation that we had, which is again really interesting, is if if our economy is really a predatory economy, then your first comment was, yes, but we need predators in the cycle of life, and then that we're out of balance now. And that's also, I found that a very helpful and engaging way to sort of assess where we are. I think humans, well, I speak maybe more of just myself, but I think I know other people as well who are very quick to be like, it's bad, we're destroying everything, and really to wake up to actually the pain and the harm that we've created by not keeping the cycle alive. Being predatory isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, it's um I was thinking about this a little bit earlier. In a natural cycle, there are predators um, who are, there's fewer predators than there are, prey, if you will, and some species cross over, like I think you say coyotes in the US, it's coyotes in Canada, are crossover between predator and prey, and they're very resilient to a disruption in their lives. Um, but So when you have I was thinking it's almost like in an economic system, it's like the predator is kind of put all its prey in a box or something so that it's easily accessible. And I don't know if this analogy is actually working. You can
You're good. You're good. We're putting our predator, our prey in a box, which actually means that as a predator, you can get lazy and not have to, oh, here's your food in plastic and wrapped and whatever. I mean, I know we're playing with an analogy a little bit, but to sort of go off on that, it's.
But it's true.
We've taken ourselves. Yeah, and we've made in that process of trying to simplify our life, we've removed ourselves further and further from life and from
Yeah,
the cycle of life.
yeah,
Um,
and yeah, and in our soundbite world, um, we've lost the nuance and subtlety and complexity that is life, that is nature, that requires a certain kind of attention, um, that you don't get in a soundbite.
mhm, mhm.
There's a depth, um, that you know that is required to make the shifts that we're talking about, to move toward the systems that do support life. um, there's that Einstein quote: "You can't um,
You can't build.
on the from the place from which it was created," or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it. You can't solve a problem with the for the from yeah with the place it was created. I can't remember the exact quote, but yeah, yeah.
I'm sure people are familiar with it. um, so one of the things I've started to ask myself in my own decisions, in my own life, in my own work, my own relationships, and it's what serves life best.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, just that one question, and to allow that to help me sort of navigate. I'm not doing all the things yet. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Well, you remind me. There's an author and speaker, Rochelle Lamb, who actually is going to be speaking with us later on in the Reaction to Response series. She's going to be speaking about grief in December, and yeah, and I bring her up because one of the things I read of hers, she was talking about how hard it is to actually make this shift, and most of us don't want it. We don't, to your point, we don't want to give up our, quick drive-through coffee, or our like, oh, I can just, order my groceries delivered, and which is a growing industry too, because now we can send organic, healthy food to you in a box. Oh, wait, all of that food is now wrapped in plastic. Oh, but it's biodegradable plastic. Don't worry. But then I just read a quite terrifying, frankly, report which talked about how in those boxes, the ice packs, even not all of them are actually like the chemicals in them. Where are they going to go? It's going to get seeped back into the land. Oh, great. Okay. So it just keeps the solutions that we're finding are short term, maybe, and there's more and more problems with it, which is kind of interesting because when you put things in a predatory framework, inevitably in everything there is something good and something really a little scary. Like, oh, we'll switch to environmentally friendly cars, we'll switch to an electric car, but then what do we do with the battery once it's dead?
Yeah, and
I mean,
yeah, all that.
yeah.
And just to your point about cars, the most environmentally friendly car is the one you already have, regardless of how eco anything else is, because of the embedded energy in just creating the car itself. Um, anyway, it's just, but
Well,
but
it's relevant. It's not just to be dismissive. That's actually a very relevant point. I don't want to cut you off for a
no,
second.
no, please go ahead.
But just to recognize this mentality we have, new, get something new. It's also, I believe it's also that new thing is also tapping into our inherent relationship with life and death.
Hmm.
Because we want something new, that means that something old has to die. So is this a distorted view about our own relationship to the cycle of life and death?
Hmm.
You know, uh,
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the reskilling, if you will, are some capacity building, inner capacities, that um, in theory, and hopefully, I believe in practice, indigenous cultures had, that understandings about death that weren't an avoidance strategy. It was like avoid thinking about, talking about dying. None of us get out of this gig alive. That's just real. and and the more skill and capacity and compassion and love and um, understanding we can bring to the dying of things and grieving them well. Um, I'm glad you're having Rochelle on. She's awesome. I know her work, and she'll speak a lot more about this. But you know, and understanding grieving as the way you love something once it's gone, and various um, um, ways of dealing with the death is definitely a huge part in my mind of the skills that are needing to come forward. And getting back to education, we need to train people to help people to navigate those kinds of things. There are already huge disruptions happening and migrations of people from Syria, for example, um, you know, climate refugees, if you will, that are starting, that's already starting to happen. And those people, there's trauma involved in that. There's grieving in leaving their lives. There's a death of a life that's occurring. And there's and you know, so you know, I've thought about it. It's like, okay, if I couldn't have a car, I would grieve that. I like having a car. You know, it supports the life as I'm living it now. So I'm starting to sort of shift my thinking and my heart around, you know, what if I did live a more local life as was once normal? And like the local indigenous Lekwungen people, they lived here on the southern part of the island for part of the year, and they went across to their fishing grounds on the other part of the year, and that was their world. There were so many resources here. That's all they need. That's as long as they needed to travel. The Cree or Blackfoot or other indigenous peoples in the interior of Canada and the US too, actually, they needed to travel further distances, or they followed the buffalo or whatever, but they belonged to the land. And they stayed local, and they took care of where they were. And in our detachment from place, this comes into my Healing Cities work, but our detachment from place keeps us all kind of place orphans. And not feeling that belonging, the community, the social, there's no commitment to a specific place anymore to keep it alive, to keep ourselves alive, to keep the creatures alive, to keep the vegetation alive, to keep the food supplies healthy. You know, those kinds of things are all part of shifting to an economy in support of life.
It's so interesting. I smiled because I recently had a conversation with a member of our city council, and also somebody on our city planning commission, and they were challenging that if you own a house, you're going to care more about the community than if you are a renter. And as someone who has rented around the world for pretty much all of her life, in fact, all of my life, I've never owned a home. I sat with that quite, like it really went in a little deeply, because I've always cared where I live. And then, but I saw the point of, and this touches into here, right? We've built this economy that a lot of people, you know, to the point we started off earlier about homelessness, can't actually afford to own a house. So if you can't afford to own a house, and owning a property, I mean, well, that's a whole other question of can one ever really own a property, but we'll get there in a second. But if you think you own a property anyway, we'll say it like, or if you actually do an exchange, a monetary exchange to own a piece of property, you have a vested interest. And then maybe more so than if you're just renting and running and leaving. I don't know, but it ties into what is our relationship, and what is our, even more to use your language, what is our commitment to our local community? And when you say, think about not having a car, I'm totally dependent upon my car. And yes, I can walk to a local grocery store, but most of my friends live far away. I'm beginning to locally build my community here. but it's how do we bridge this? We've built this world where technology has been so helpful in some ways to reach out, but yet we go back to this isolation thing. We're isolated within our own communities, and the question begs to be asked. So, I mean, this is common, but do I really, I'm alone, you know, and in my home. And like even now, we're sitting here and this is fabulous. We have a whole bunch of people that are going to see this video and who are watching now and are here actually in this space with us. But at the end of the day, I'm sitting in a room by myself. Granted, I have some furry creatures here too. You're in your home. Who knows where everybody else is?
Yeah.
And we close that. And where is the intimacy? If I can just cut off from connection like that,
Mm-hmm. Intimacy is challenging. It's tough. We this is part of the reskilling. We've forgotten. In I'm making a broad generalization there, and there are places that haven't forgotten. But many of us, myself included, have forgotten how to live in community, how to live closely with some number of people, and to make a commitment to those people, like people plural, not just nuclear family necessarily, but friends, acquaintances, somebody who might be a little off balance, whatever the case, but committing to some kind of locality. And as you were talking about, it's the people, but it's also the land. Like we were talking, you were saying, you own a house, and it made me ask the question in my head, who did it belong to that I'm buying it from? Like, how did that ever start? And it started with colonization everywhere on Earth. Europe was colonized, North America was colonized, and we just kind of moved in and built houses and then sold them to the next person, purchased the materials, and that's how it started. But prior to that, the indigenous people, and on the West Coast, especially the northwest coast of North America, they're the most recently colonized people. So there actually are living people who remember pre-colonization. I think maybe one generation down, but the land, they belonged to the land. The land did not belong to them. So who owns who? What owns what? Yeah.
Well, it touches on some really, well, there's good questions, because when we're trying to figure out what is the correct solution and how do we move forward and how can each one of us further develop our how can we take an active, responsive care and compassion-based step to move forward, to help us build or rebuild a different way, right? What does that mean we have to do? And I think part of this, there is, when we touched on it earlier, there is a grieving period that gets to happen because, I won't have my car. But also, before I even get into that element of it, and how do we adjust when we begin to wake up to like, oh my gosh, what's going on, and the pain that causes. Also, I am reminded that we've built a world that is so structured, and we've tried to linear everything. Nature's not linear. It's chaotic. It's messy. But humans, we're the same. We're a mess. Every single one of us, we think we have our stuff together, right? I don't know one person who really has it together. When you actually there's a reason The Wizard of Oz is still popular, right? Because there's the man who's controlling everything that's behind the screen, and he's a disaster. He's a wreck, right? So, and that's not a comment on gender, for the record here, since we are focusing on girls. This is the human state. We're a wreck. And, later on this month, we're going to be having Mark Silver on, who I know you also know. And he's going to be, yeah, he's going to be speaking with people who are trying to build businesses, staying in integrity and heart-centered. But I mention him because I had a conversation with him also a few days ago, and the word that kept coming up, and I know that Sandy Hart, the director of the Women and Girls sector, is going to probably smile when she hears this word, because we dance with it a bit, is chaotic, right? It's chaotic, and it's that dance of chaos and order.
Yeah.
Because
and every now and again you hit that intersection, in the middle.
Right. And so, and that's also, I love that word too, because it helps us shift.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us be like, oh, okay, this is chaotic, because I can't actually step into chaos, because chaos is terrifying, right? Because in chaos, it means you have to be totally vulnerable. Mm-hmm. You have to be really present, mm-hmm. because you have to be able to process internally, how do I handle chaos? Mm-hmm. How do I handle my emotions? How do I handle my feelings? How do I handle that which I cannot control? Mm-hmm. And this actually ties into, I think, a lot of the feminist perspective of things, because we've built things which are patriarchal and hierarchical, which again, it's very linear and structured, mm-hmm. whereas a feminine energy is a little bit more curvy and softer, and I'm not making one wrong. That's not where I'm coming from at all. It's really that intersection of chaos and order, and we've also touched on this subject on other calls. But I think when we talk about living an economy to life, in service to life, it is that balance of the masculine and the feminine. Hold on one second.
Yeah. And anything else along the gender spectrum.
Right. Well, exactly. That's right. Totally. Absolutely. That's right. I'm not, and you're touching on something else that's actually very interesting, going back to indigenous cultures and living economy, right? Because when I'm talking about masculine and feminine, I'm not talking about men and women or gender. I'm talking about the principles of masculine and feminine.
Yeah. And it's a spectrum, of how mm-hmm. much we have of any of those mm-hmm. in any of us, regardless of our external things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a really important piece too, because many of us, depending upon our age bracket, were raised very linear. Men, women, masculine, feminine, not this fluidity.
Right. Yes, no,
Right.
Yeah.
And that, I think, also goes into living an economy that is in service to life, recognizing the chaos. And Sandy, and I also just had a conversation the other day, and I hope I can speak on her behalf here. One of her words that she's completely enamored with right now is festooning. And how would she? I think she would describe it like this, and I have a feeling in the after party she'll probably correct me if I'm wrong, or reframe what I'm saying here. Yeah. But basically, it's coming from the bees and the sacred. What was it, nectar that gets shared among them, and so that they go off in clusters, but they're still connected, and how they build their hives. And so it's a beautiful analogy that she shared with me the other day. I'm like, oh, I get it, right? It's we're these clusters building a world, and that there's a very feminine principle in that. And I hope she'll, if I misrepresented that, I hope she'll correct me here. But
it's a village. If you will. It's like a global world of villages, mm-hmm. And I think things like the internet have, used in integrity and right relationship, if you want to call it that, to use the Buddhist term. It is sort of, so there's sort of a think global, act local kind of thing, but it connects the villages, so they're learning from each other. And being in place.
So you're reminding me again, going back, and I should stop talking so much and let you talk a little bit. But the beauty of the internet and technology is it can be that nectar which brings each cluster together, and we can be sharing information. What have you learned in your little community? And as you develop intimacy and as you move into chaos um, and vulnerability and fear and grief and joy and magnificence and beauty, because actually in that intimacy there are these things that we've forgotten that are so fulfilling and so meaningful, right? But yet we can still keep our nectar out. I
Well,
see.
and oxytocin.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
Um, um, when we're in community and when we have eye contact with people, this is something that comes out of my Healing Cities work, is like the speed with which we travel. Um, road rage is in part because we're not making eye contact. When you make eye contact with somebody, oxytocin is released.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so when you're in community and you're walking around and or cycling, you can look people in the eye and just there's a note here from Sandy that it helps us bond with people to festoon
Hmm.
that hormone. um and it's, it's the cuddle hormone, it's the feel good hormone, it's the it's part of the physiology of opening our hearts to other people,
Hmm.
the physiological component of
Hmm.
that. um and and so when we're living in a local, eco villages are working on this, already. Some neighborhoods are working on this already. um but so when we're living in the village, we develop those connections, we care about the people, even if we don't like them, like that happens too, but we still have a connection with them and we care about them and we even love them.
Hmm. Hmm. Right.
um, Even if there's somebody that's sort of, you know makes
Mhm.
you cranky or whatever it is.
Well, it's interesting too, because there are also the role that mirror neurons play in this. I watch you doing something, or I even think about you doing something, and then my brain thinks I'm actually doing it, which
Yeah.
which touches. This is how a lot of athletes will train, right? They'll watch a video or watch a game and absorb it into their body. And so too, if I look at you and I see you smiling at me and loving me, like physiologically, biologically, my body says smile back, as long as I don't see that you like have a gun or a knife in your hand while you're smiling at me.
Right.
Right. But that aside, but it also does touch into, again, the role of technology, right? And I'm not trying to be anti-video games yet. We have people from around the world engaging in fake realities, or actually I can't call virtual realities, it's another reality, because in many ways, because of things like mirror neurons, it's very real. So if you're interacting, when we're seeing this, like with people who are manning drones, and while they're not actually in combat and face to face with somebody in a life and death violent situation, the drone operators are still maybe killing people, and having really intense PTSD. And what's a challenge with something like that, then becomes, but I didn't do anything. I was safe in my home, and I just pushed a button. They
Mhm.
did.
Mhm.
And and then this really ties back into, what does it mean to be in an economy that's in service to life? Because certainly, there are people who are profiting off of war. It's
Yeah.
a whole military industrial complex.
Yeah, we could go there.
Yeah.
Run
Well,
another one.
yeah, it's true. And it's really, it can be overwhelming, on how do we look at this, and how do we make sense when we actually wake up to all of these things?
Hmm. It's
How do we choose differently?
it's tough,
Um,
and I think it's incumbent upon us who are thinking about these things, and working through these things and working through our own inner guilt, grief, terror, whatever, various kinds of fears, whatever it is, and we're working with it, and it's incumbent on us to stand at the shoulders of other people who are feeling that overwhelm, and
mm,
um and we need people to stand at our shoulders too, to help steer us
Mm-hmm.
along the way. It's tough, and we need each other in those ways. By the way, what I do have in my hand is a talking stick that I got from Heshquit woman, another Indigenous band here on Vancouver Island.
So for those who may be on the call who are not familiar with the talking stick, would you care to?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I use this when I do events where there's some kind of a circle where people are talking in a circle, and the intention with the talking stick is whoever holds the talking stick is the only person who talks, and you don't offer any feedback or comment or engage in a conversation. You just let them say what they have to say. And in Indigenous cultures, it could take days to go around a circle. People just kept talking till they were done. We don't have many contexts like that anymore, and so usually it's like you have your 2 minutes and then you pass the talking stick along. But that's what a talking stick is. I mean, there are many. They look in very many different ways. This one happens to look like a feather.
So, and just let's go down this road a little bit, because I think it's actually very relevant to building a world in service to life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's first communication, right? And if my mother's on this call, she's probably gonna like be all over me for what I'm about to say. But which is like multitasking and communication is horrible. Yes, Mom, I hear you. Because I'm not all. I mean, I'm one of the first ones to like have a growth opportunity. We'll say it like that, to stop the multitasking and to really be present with someone when we're speaking. And how many things, because we multitask, not only do we not hear, but also do we not say. And if I don't have the space to say to you what I need to say to you, it's going to actually sit inside me, especially if it's about challenge or discomfort. Then I sit and I internalize it, and it can make me feel angry, sad, depressed. How much of what we're holding inside that maybe leads to depression or not feeling well are unspoken words, because we don't have the time or the space to speak to one another.
Or even the skill set on how we think we don't know how to do it. Probably do ultimately, but we think we don't. And
Nicole, I'm just going to interrupt on the pauses of speaking. So, every time that you look down, the whole screen kind of goes really, really dark. So if we can have your beautiful being with us, thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, it's awkward, especially with this big window back behind me that lights me from behind.
Yeah, it's good. It illuminates you. And the sake of using you and I as an opportunity, playing in the space of shadow, right? This is a perfect timing to bring this, because our shadow self, how do we express it? So I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's a brilliant segment. I was doing it exactly for that reason.
Excellent.
It was a subtle thing. I was waiting for you to pick up on it. But here it's part of the point. Actually, it's like we miss the subtlety, we miss the nuance, we miss the depth and complexity that is part of each of us, that is part of our environments, that is part of a community of people who are together for one reason or another, whether it's they live their lives together or they come together for some other reason in community. But we miss the nuance, and we miss developing the capacity to notice things like that. And some of my other work has to do with pilgrimage and taking opportunities, even 10-minute opportunities in the neighborhood, to notice specific things, like to walk your neighborhood and just look at birds and see what happens when you look for birds, or notice the flowers and just notice different flowers and how beautiful they are, or just notice patterns in plants. We're looking for spiral things that grow in kind of spiral, whatever whatever it is, or making a point of smiling at everybody you walk past, or making a point of frowning at everybody you walk past, and just notice the differences and the subtleties and how you feel differently inside and where that comes from, and or saying hello to everybody, or speaking to people in a language other than English, and seeing what happens when you do that. I mean, it's just it just has become a bit of a practice for me to sort of move about my own neighborhood on pilgrimage, and with that hat on, because it puts me in a different frame of noticing subtleties and nuance and depth, where it's like, it's just a sidewalk, and it's like, well, no, this part's new and that part's worn out, and this one's been repaired and that one needs repair, and even something as simple as sidewalks and parking meters, and
Well, it helps you understand your community.
it does,
And
and it helps you belong to the place.
Right. I just want to go back because I forgot. I got a little bit sidetracked because I heard my mother's voice in my head. When I was talking about
moms do that, yeah.
When I was talking about the talking stick. So you reminded me of something, that this is actually a very practical tool, excuse me, to have in one's home. Even, in fact, I have a friend who sits there and she keeps always on her a lighter. And the purpose of the lighter is because when you have the lighter, you have the fire and you have the light. And so even when she and her partner sit down in a conversation, even if it's how are you and how was your day, in order to fully be able to express it, whether it's the mundane or the my feelings got hurt or whatever, when you're holding the lighter, you have the floor and you have the undivided attention. And so I bring that up because the idea of a talking stick actually helps to improve relationships, even in a family dynamic. It doesn't have to be a community gathering, just in intimacy and honoring the other. And I can say that I've known you for a number of years, and one of the things that I've learned from you, or received acceptance on, is maybe a better word, or both, is this place of, if we have to repeat something, if I have a story I have to tell you and I've repeated it like 10 times to you, there's still something that either I need to share, express, learn, or understand, and it's something that's in my space. Mm-hmm. And that needs to be healed or cleaned or cleared, or there's something I can learn. There's a reason for it. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it grew out of an agreement with my husband, because in our culture we said, oh, I probably said this before, or oh, I've already said this, and so we don't say it. But we have this agreement that if it's coming up, it needs to be said. Either in the case of my husband and I, he needs, if it's something that's coming up for him, he needs to say it again, and it's always different. Like, that's the other thing. It's always different, so it becomes a practice of storytelling in a way. Or there's something I need to hear differently because he's saying it slightly differently or whatever. So there's a dialectic exchange. Like, it's both sides of that story. If it's coming up, it needs to be said again, and that's okay. And you're right. You can use anything for a talking stick. You can use a pen, or I looked down again, didn't I? Or this is a little stone heart, or anything, just something that you imbue with that power, and use it. Yeah.
So I'm just checking in because we have about 2 minutes left. So I want to sort of come back full circle. Yeah, that went really fast. Again, we're talking about living an economy in service to life. And so when we start off, first, we think about the term economy, and we think GDP, which we start as or corporations, right? Which, as we said at the beginning of this, actually are not the real intentions of either of these things which are governing our life right now, which are rooted in trauma and illness, right? And
measuring only one aspect of wealth,
right? Yeah. And that's even whether that's real wealth is questionable too.
Yeah. We did
which
talk about having some method of exchange. Has been around for a long, long time, that has value, like coins or something like that. Because if we use the example, if I have a goat and you have a bushel of wheat, I might not need a bushel of wheat, so you might have to give me some other thing that holds value. We have cash in exchange for my goat.
Mhm.
I like goats.
Yeah.
And I don't eat wheat, so there you go. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. But I mean, that's a whole other conversation that we
Mhm.
could wind up going down the road.
Yeah.
Um, but really, because we touched on very much more of sort of the interpersonal piece to it, and that's the piece that's very often missing when we look at the economy. And when we're talking about an economy and service to life, life is really in the intimacy and in the communication and in the commitment, which we also talked about, to rebuild a world that is maybe a little bit more local
Mhm.
and where we choose and question. Um,
And the communication and intimacy is so important, because we start to understand each other, and
right.
and in that understanding, um, there's I think it's one of the tribes in the Okanagan here in British Columbia has an expression, tell something to the effect of, tell me the thing that's the opposite of what I believe so that I can learn.
Mm. Oh, that's beautiful. That's
Yeah. And so that builds an intimacy, it builds an understanding. It allows in the pieces that help to create that kind of village connection.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right on. So on this note, I'm going to just put up on the screen one more. Where are we? Oops. Um, the after party, or for those of you who are already here, we're going to switch over to the after party. If you look in the chat section, you can, where are we? Hold on, there we go. You can see the link to our after party, and also if you can't see it there, you should be able to see it right now on my screen. Whoops, wrong one. There we go. And it is http://bit.ly/CCIR2R. And while anybody may be jotting that down, I will just once again thank you, Nicole, for being here. And if you are watching this after we've recorded it, I'm sorry you won't be able to join us, but you'll be able to see the video afterwards. And this month we do have 2 other speakers instead of just one. The next speaker will be next Wednesday on August 9th. It'll be Natalie Pace, and she's going to be speaking directly about protecting yourself from a predatory economy. And then on August 16th, we'll be having Mark Silver, who will be speaking about building your business, whether it's a small sole proprietorship to a medium or large size corporation, based on integrity and the values of your heart. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us, and we'll see you in a week.
Thank
Bye.
you, Lisa. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, we'll see you all in the after party. Bye.
Okay, bye.